Josee Laframboise, and she is a program officer with the National Aquatic Animal Health Program. She's been working with the program since 2008, which was prior to the program's implementation, developing the program framework and consultation. In her current role, Josee develops policies, procedures, and industry standards for the domestic disease control portion of the program. This includes files that relate to disease response and domestic movement control. Josee.
Thanks, Nicholas. Just a note on the CFI. I guess the agency maybe isn't named in the most appropriate way. We're called the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, but we do a lot more than just deal with food. Part of our mandates includes animal health as well as plant health. So my section, we deal specifically with diseases, but we also have a plant section that deals with pests, like the ones you've heard in the media, Asian longhorn beetle, and so on. As for disease, we deal with bees, fish, chicken, beef, cervids, porcine, so we deal with many animal types. But today I'm just here to talk about the National Aquatic Animal Health Program. So I'll go through, give you a quick overview of the National Aquatic Animal Health Program, our objectives, legislation, and different program components. And I'll talk about the federally regulated diseases, so the criteria we use to decide which diseases should be regulated at a federal level. And then we'll talk about a bit about the science that we use, which is diagnostics, surveillance, and risk assessment. And then I'll finish it off with our two major program components would be domestic disease control. So that's early detection, disease response, and then movement controls from areas where disease exists to areas where disease doesn't currently exist, or the specific federally regulated diseases don't specifically exist. And we'll talk about trade a bit, so import and export, how that feeds into our program, and I'll just finish it off with compliance and enforcement. So the objective of the National Aquatic Animal Health Program is to prevent the introduction and spread of federally regulated diseases, which may affect both wild and cultured aquatic animal species. And as defined in the Health of Animals regulations, the aquatic animals include finfish, mollusks, and crustaceans. So we don't deal with things like echinid worms and other animal types out there. The authority is mostly described in the Health of Animals Act, Health of Animals regulations, and the reportable diseases regulations, but we're also subject to other federal regulations like the Access to Information Act, Privacy Act, Compensation for Animals Ordered Destroyed, and Monetary Penalties Act. So those are other ones that we use quite frequently as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have two major components, so domestic disease control and import-export. So not all diseases are federally regulated. Provinces also have disease requirements. Typically, those that are federally regulated are based on these three criteria. These criteria are consistent with what is recommended by the International Organization for Animal Health. So we look at the consequences, the spread, and the ability to diagnose the disease. So for consequences, the CFIA has to show significant production losses in cultured aquatic animals, or it had significant impacts on wild aquatic animal populations, and or the disease is a public health issue. For the aquatic animal diseases that are federally regulated, none of them have shown any, don't pose any public health concerns, but we did approach Health Canada to see if we should list any diseases for that reason. And then spread, so the disease has to be infectious in nature and has to have potential for spread through domestic or international trade. So we don't list diseases that occur that are enzootic throughout Canada. And then the third thing that's very, very important is diagnosis. So you need a repeatable and robust means of detection or diagnosis. You really can't control a disease that you can't find, and you don't know where it is, and then it's really hard to put in place control measures as well, right? Unless you do absolute prohibitions on any potential risk of movement. So once we decide on which diseases should be federally regulated based on those criteria, we listed them in our legislation. So so the CFI could respond to any disease, but where it's listed in the regulation gives us access to gives us certain, I guess, powers. So if it's listed in the reportable diseases regulation, then anybody who works with aquatic animals, so veterinarians or biologists, etc., or anyone who owns aquatic animals, or any laboratory that suspects or detects a disease, has to notify the CFIA. So that's an absolute legislative requirement. And there's also an absolute prohibition in our legislation to conceal disease information from the CFIA. So this is really, really useful because oftentimes when there is a disease detection or suspicion of disease, we'll receive that notification from multiple partners. So we might hear it from the producer, the farmer who's dealing with the cultured aquatic species. We'll hear about it from the lab, and we'll hear about it from their vet, from very multiple sources. So if someone's not aware of their legislative requirement, you kind of cover your bases that way. The immediately notifiable diseases are listed in the Health of Animals regulations, and all of those diseases are exotic to Canada. And the reason they're listed in that piece of legislation is that it's unlikely that anybody would suspect that disease unless they're doing diagnostic work in a laboratory. So the only person that's legally required to notify the CFIA of suspicion or detection of that disease would be the laboratory. Like I said, listing the disease gives us certain powers. So for the reportable diseases, we can take any animal for sampling to test them for the reportable diseases. We can zone Canada into eradication areas depending on where the disease exists and where it doesn't exist. And then we can also put in place import requirements to prevent the introduction of that disease into Canada. So of the reportable diseases, 11 out of 20 of them are in Canada. So some areas of Canada are free. Of course, as I mentioned before, if any of those diseases is found everywhere in Canada, then it would come off the list. Because at that point, you can't prevent the spread within your country. So the science that we use really is diagnostic, surveillance, and risk assessment. We have a science branch at the CFIA with the surveillance unit, and what they do is they'll look at historical data and epidemiological evidence to describe the likely status of different areas within Canada. So they do surveys of laboratories, they might consult with the provinces, so a lot of the provinces have surveillance initiatives in place. And based on that, they'll say, well, the likelihood of this area being infected is this. They'll identify the gaps, and from there they develop a surveillance plan to close those gaps. The surveillance initiatives that they do, like we can't test everything, so they'll identify, the most susceptible species, where that species is found, and then they can work with provincial governments, fishermen, and First Nations to collect the samples that we need. And all the samples are tested at the National Aquatic Animal Health Laboratory System, which is run by BFO. Based on the likely disease status of Canada, then my section, domestic disease control and import-export, can make declarations on the disease status for Canada. And that allows us to put in place certain controls. Domestic disease control and import-export, we use risk assessment to determine the high-risk movements, high-risk species, and end uses that require controls so that we can prevent the spread. of these diseases within Canada or from coming into Canada. We also use science to develop the mitigation measures so that if a species is moved that for an end use that is high risk, then we can render the risk as negligible through mitigation measures. Just a final point on science is to use taxonomic names. In Canada, we have partnerships with the United States and Mexico on the Integrated Taxonomic Information System. And sometimes I see in provincial legislation where they use a common name for species prohibition. And this makes it very, very difficult, especially when you're dealing internationally, because some species don't have an English common name. And one common name might apply to multiple species. So from a regulatory perspective, using the taxonomic name is extremely important. They've done a pretty good job. So when I took this screenshot, and on April 7th, they had agreed on 646,000 common and taxonomic names. But if ever you need to control a species that isn't in the ITIS, then it'd be great for the federal government agencies to get together and agree on which common name should be used. And ITIS is available to everyone. You can access it from home. It's not only available to the government of Canada. Okay, so the domestic movement control program, again, that's just to control disease within Canada. We can declare certain areas of Canada as infected, buffer-free, or provisionally free for different diseases. And then from there, movements that pose a risk will require a permit to move from an area where the disease exists to an area where the disease doesn't exist. To move within an area that's infected or between two areas that are infected, then no permit is required. We also have a program called the compartmentalization program. So this allows a facility in an area that's infected to demonstrate through biosecurity, like very stringent biosecurity testing, and then we do inspections and testing as well to make sure that they're complying with their biosecurity. Based on those strict biosecurity standards, we can recognize them as being disease-free, so that they can move within Canada without too much red tape. And on the import side, so as I mentioned, of the regulated disease, then they can put import requirements to make sure those diseases aren't coming into Canada. For the reportable diseases, the species that are susceptible are listed in Schedule 3 of the Health of Animals regulations. So if a species isn't listed in Schedule 3, then you can bring it in without an import permit, but you still have to provide some high-level information like the taxonomic name, the origin, and the quantity. So the import requirements and the conditions that go along with the import are all posted on the website. It's called the Automated Import Reference System, which is accessible through the CFI website. And those conditions are enforced at the border by the Canadian Border Services Agency. So by having a domestic disease control program that's consistent with the international standard that's set by the World Organization for Animal Health, then we can put in place import requirements to prevent the disease from being introduced, and this will facilitate exports as well. According to the WTO, you can't put stricter requirements on things coming in than what you control domestically. So if we don't have a disease control program in Canada, we can't put disease control measures in place on imports coming in. So verifying compliance and enforcement is something that you have to think about very, very early on in a program, because your legislation has to allow you to do the things that you need to do to verify compliance, right? So the ability to look at records, to do inspections, to test animals, all those things needs to be specified in your regulations or in your act. So the stakeholders and Canadian citizens also have requirements, like the requirement to notify disease, to comply with disease eradication and response measures, to obtain an import permit, or to obtain a permit under the Domestic Movement Control Program. Based on that, we can look at high-risk activities, or industries that conduct high-risk activities, look at their records. So, you know, where did you get your animals from? Did you get the required permits? And we can test their animals to see if they're infected with disease or not. Or look at mortality records to see if maybe they've been concealing the fact that they have a disease. On the import side, they can do import like enforcement blitzes, where they'll look at imports coming in, make sure they provide the taxonomic name, that the species they say they're bringing in is actually the species that they're bringing in, and so on and so forth. And then the enforcement actions can range from a warning to a monetary penalty as specified in the Monetary Penalties Act, seizure, and prosecution. And that's it for me. So, are there any questions?
Questions?
From what I've read, at least in the U.S., when they're trying to do kind of one-day blitz, and they're trying to match up the species names on import records with the species that are actually there, there's not really a lot in common. How much when you do your enforcement blitzes are you finding that import records aren't correct?
Yeah, so I work on the domestic side. I know that is a common challenge. I can't give you a number on how accurate the taxonomic names matches with what's being brought in. I know the CBSA does have some challenges because, you know, like the animals will be in the warehouse and they have access to a database to match up the taxonomic name with what they're seeing that's coming in through import. But sometimes that database isn't always available to them in the warehouse, so there are challenges at that end as well. So I can't give you a specific number, but I do know that is a common challenge, yeah.
Do you have a feel for how leaky the import system is in terms of how many diseases are coming through the system and then getting into like the aquarium trade, for example?
To date, we haven't had a disease detection in Canada that was traced back to an import.
Okay.
Now, the program is quite new. We've only been into place since 2009. So I think it's pretty good. Like there are challenges, but I think that for the most part, it's pretty good. Yeah. Yes?
From a wildlife health perspective, how do you feel about the application of biocontrol as a way of managing invasive species?
Yeah, I'm not an invasive species expert. I know from the disease perspective, once this disease has been established in the wild, we switch from eradication to control from preventing the spread from that area. I haven't seen so much on the disease side as far as being able to eradicate a disease that's established in the wild.
Other questions? I have a question, perhaps a comment, and I was hoping Tracy was here, but I think she stepped out. But the one thing is these new regulations that actually prevent the importation of animals that are known vectors of these reportable diseases, correct? There's 300 or 400 of those animals listed, right? Many of those species are considered invasive in some place in the world. And many of those species actually will likely overlap these potential invasive species lists that we're developing for Canada. And I think it would be very useful for DFO to consider how they might collaborate with your organization to enforce a single list of species that are in common.
Mm.
And that was one of the reasons I was really interested in having you come here, because I think there's similar challenges. And in addition to these invasive species that are on your list, obviously when we do risk assessments for invasive species, we're concerned about disease as well. And having this list of vectors and reportable diseases, I think makes our job easier in trying to determine the disease risks of invasives.
Yeah, synchrony between DFO and CFIA from that respect would be useful. I do actually have an example in BC for the European flat oyster. I was brought into BC for culture. I wouldn't call it, I don't think it meets the criteria of being invasive, but there are a few feral populations of European flat oyster in BC. And when that species was brought in, brought along Banana austrae. In that situation, we were lucky because species that are native species in Canada weren't susceptible to that disease. But in a different situation, we might not have been so lucky. We could have brought in a disease that would impact the native oyster population of BC. So, yes, Matthias?
Yeah, I guess I just want to add also what Nick was saying. I think it's a bit of there are a lot of lists. Like for BC, we're effectively going to soon have 4 different lists of aquatic species which are prohibited for one or another reason. And having those lists match closer and also linked to each other, I think would be a real benefit because I kind of feel sorry for people who want to import these animals because it's getting pretty confusing. And I know we had issues with, one database. If someone gets a permit from one agency, it's at the moment I don't think it always is clear that, well, it's okay for us, but you have to talk to the province because they might have a different list, and you might be able to bring them across the border, but within the border it's illegal. I think that's one issue we could work together. And I guess the other one, also around risk assessment, because you guys have done those disease risk assessment for all those 430 species to a degree, and I know a while ago I tried to get a look at some of those, and are those confidential or are those publicly available?
No, so for the susceptible species, we looked at the literature and looked to find species that were shown to be naturally susceptible to the diseases of concern. So the ability to become infected and the ability to transmit infection to other aquatic animals were through natural modes of disease transmission. They're not confidential, but they're just based on the scientific literature. So someone looked at the science that was available, looked at different challenge trials for disease, and then developed a list of which species should be susceptible. So, whereas our risk assessment process is way more, so I guess really what you would be looking for is the references that we use to determine which species are susceptible, which I can look into.
Okay. Because it would be beneficial if we, provincially for the introduction and transfer, we have to do some random species is applied for. We could look up what you guys found. That would be very beneficial for us, and I'm sure for Nick doing risk assessment as well for the disease component, which is always seems to be very difficult for a lot of the aquatic species to see what you guys found.
Okay. Yeah, so it really wouldn't be a risk assessment per se, but a list of references of scientific articles we use to make certain decisions on the species that were listed, which I'll talk to Joanne Constantine about. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.